The golden prairie dust swirled around Sarah Larson's boots as she stood rigid before the charred remains of what had once been her family ranch. A single tear escaped down her dirt-smudged cheek, but she quickly wiped it away, refusing to show weakness even when alone. The year was 1875, and in West Texas, weakness was a luxury no one could afford, especially not a woman who had just lost everything. "I'll never trust again," Sarah whispered to the empty horizon, her voice catching on the last word. Never. At 22, Sarah had already endured more than most people faced in a lifetime. Her father's ranch outside Dallas, Texas, once prosperous with cattle and crops, now lay in ruins, burned to the ground by the same man who had stolen her heart and betrayed her trust. James Holloway had courted her for months, his sweet words and gentle touches making her believe in love and the promise of a future together. She'd never suspected he was only after her father's land and the rumored gold deposit beneath it. When her father refused to sell, James and his gang attacked in the dead of night. Her father died defending what was his, and Sarah barely escaped with her life. All she had left were the clothes on her back, her father's old revolver, and a heart turned to stone. The distant sound of hoofbeats pulled Sarah from her bitter thoughts. She tucked the revolver into the folds of her skirt, her fingers tightening around the handle as she watched a lone rider approach. The stranger rode a magnificent chestnut stallion, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the setting Texas sun. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, but as he drew closer, Sarah could make out a strong jaw covered with several days' worth of stubble and eyes the color of a summer sky. "Evening, miss," the rider said, tipping his hat. "Seems like you might be in some trouble." "I'm fine," Sarah replied, her voice cold as a winter creek. "Just passing through." The man's eyes traveled from her face to the smoking ruins behind her, then back again. "Name's Blake Quinn," he said, dismounting with fluid grace that spoke of years in the saddle. "I ranch about 10 miles west of here. Saw the smoke yesterday, came to check if anyone needed help." "You're a day late," Sarah said bitterly. Blake's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss. Was it bandits?" "It was a snake disguised as a man," she answered, her gaze drifting back to the charred timbers that had once been her home. "You got somewhere to go?" Blake asked, his tone gentle but direct. Sarah raised her chin defiantly. "I don't need your charity, Mr. Quinn." "It's not charity to help a neighbor," Blake said. "And out here we're all neighbors. There's a town about 5 miles east Oak Ridge. Not much to look at, but they've got a decent boarding house. I could escort you there." "I can find my own way," Sarah insisted. Blake nodded, respecting her stubborn independence. "As you wish." He turned back to his horse, then paused. "Mind if I ask your name for a moment?" Sarah considered giving him a false name, but something in his honest gaze stopped her. "Sarah Larson." "Miss Larson," he acknowledged with another tip of his hat. He mounted his horse with the same easy grace, then looked down at her. "If you change your mind, my offer stands. The road to Oak Ridge can be dangerous for a lone traveler." Sarah watched him ride a few paces before the practicality her father had instilled in her won out over her pride. "Mr. Quinn," she called after him. He reined in his horse, turning in the saddle to look back at her. "I would appreciate that escort to town," she said, the words feeling like gravel in her throat. "But don't mistake gratitude for trust." A smile tugged at the corner of Blake's mouth. "I wouldn't dream of it." He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Sarah took it, allowing him to help her onto his horse. She settled behind him, keeping as much distance between them as the saddle would allow. "You can hold on to me," Blake said over his shoulder as the horse began to move. "I promise I don't bite." "I'll manage," Sarah replied stiffly, gripping the back of the saddle instead. As they rode toward Oak Ridge, Sarah felt the weight of her loss press down upon her. Her home, her father, her future all gone in a single night of flames and violence. She would rebuild her life somehow, but one thing was certain. She would never again let a man close enough to destroy her. The town of Oak Ridge was little more than a dusty main street lined with wooden buildings. A general store, a saloon, a small church, and the promised boarding house made up the heart of the settlement. Blake brought his horse to a stop in front of the two-story boarding house, its white paint peeling under the harsh Texas sun. "Mrs. Henderson runs this place," Blake explained as he helped Sarah dismount. "She's stern but fair, and she keeps the cleanest rooms in 3 counties. Sarah nodded, then reached into her boot where she'd hidden a few coins before fleeing her burning home. "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Quinn. I can manage from here." Blake studied her for a moment, then shook his head. "At least let me introduce you to Mrs. Henderson. She can be particular about who she rents to." Before Sarah could protest, the door to the boarding house swung open, revealing a stout woman with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Blake Quinn," the woman said, her hands on her hips. "Twice in 1 month, people will talk." Blake chuckled. "Mrs. Henderson, this is Miss Sarah Larson. She's in need of a room." Mrs. Henderson's sharp eyes softened slightly as they took in Sarah's disheveled appearance. "The Larson place. I heard there was trouble out that way." Sarah straightened her spine. "Yes, madam. The ranch is gone, and so is my father." The older woman clicked her tongue sympathetically. "Come in, child. We'll get you settled." Sarah turned to Blake, holding out the coins she'd retrieved. "For your trouble." Blake made no move to take the money. "Keep it. You'll need it more than I do." "I don't accept charity," Sarah insisted. "Then consider it a loan," Blake replied. "You can pay me back when you're on your feet again." Sarah reluctantly put the money away, knowing he was right. She'd need every penny to survive until she figured out her next move. "Thank you," she said stiffly. Blake nodded. "I'll be in town for a few days on business. If you need anything, you can find me at the saloon or the livery." "I won't need anything," Sarah assured him. A ghost of a smile crossed Blake's face. "Of course not. Good day, Miss Larson." As Sarah watched him walk away, she couldn't help but notice the way other townspeople greeted him with genuine warmth and respect. He was clearly well regarded in Oak Ridge, but Sarah reminded herself that James had been well liked too. Appearances could be deceiving, and she wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Mrs. Henderson showed Sarah to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor. "Washrooms down the hall. Breakfast is at 6, lunch at noon, and dinner at 6 in the evening. Miss any of those times and you'll go hungry until the next meal." "Yes, madam," Sarah said, taking in the narrow bed, small dresser, and rocking chair that comprised the room's furnishings. "What happened out at your place?" the older woman asked bluntly. Sarah hesitated, then decided the truth would come out eventually. "James Holloway happened. He wanted my father's land. When Pa wouldn't sell, James and his men came at night." Mrs. Henderson's expression darkened. "Holloway's been nothing but trouble since he showed up in these parts. Him and those rough men he calls friends." She patted Sarah's arm awkwardly. "You get some rest. We'll talk more at dinner." Left alone, Sarah sank onto the bed, exhaustion finally catching up with her. For the first time since the attack, she allowed herself to weep, her sobs muffled by the thin pillow. She cried for her father, for their home, and for the naive girl she'd been just days ago, the girl who believed in love and happy endings. That girl was gone now, replaced by a woman who would never make the mistake of trusting so easily again. The next morning, Sarah awoke before dawn, her body stiff from sleeping in the same clothes she'd worn for 2 days. After washing up as best she could, she made her way downstairs to find Mrs. Henderson already busy in the kitchen. "Good, you're up," the older woman said briskly. "I've laid out some clothes that might fit you. They belonged to my daughter before she married and moved to Fort Worth." "I can't accept," Sarah began. "You can and you will," Mrs. Henderson interrupted. "You can't go around town in what you're wearing now. People will talk, and you don't need that kind of attention." Recognizing the wisdom in the woman's words, Sarah accepted the simple calico dress and sturdy boots with grudging gratitude. After changing, she helped Mrs. Henderson prepare breakfast for the boarding house's other guests, a traveling salesman and an elderly couple passing through on their way to visit family in San Antonio. "What are your plans now, girl?" Mrs. Henderson asked as they washed dishes after the meal. Sarah's hands stilled in the soapy water. "I need to find work. I have a little money, but it won't last long." "What skills do you have?" "I can cook, so tend livestock. I helped my father with the bookkeeping for the ranch," Sarah listed. Mrs. Henderson nodded thoughtfully. "Mabel over at the general store was saying just yesterday that she needs help. Her arthritis is acting up something fierce, making it hard for her to stock the shelves and serve customers. You might try there." "I will, thank you," Sarah said, genuinely grateful for the lead. After finishing the dishes, Sarah made her way to Oak Ridge General Store, a bell tinkling above the door as she entered. The shop was cluttered but clean, the shelves packed with everything from canned goods to farming tools to bolts of fabric. A thin, elderly woman looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you, miss?" Mrs. Henderson mentioned you might be looking for help, Sarah said. "I'm Sarah Larson." Recognition dawned in the woman's eyes. "Thomas Larson's girl, I heard about what happened out at your place." Terrible business. She came around the counter, moving slowly due to her evident arthritis. "I'm Mabel Wright. And yes, I could use an extra pair of hands around here." For the next hour, Mabel explained the workings of the store to Sarah, how to operate the cash register, where different items were kept, how to place orders from the catalog when customers requested special items. By the end of the conversation, Sarah had secured employment at a modest but fair wage, with the promise that she could start the following morning. As Sarah left the general store, a sense of accomplishment tempered her grief for the first time since the attack. She had a room and a job, the beginnings of a new life. She would survive this, just as she'd survived her mother's death from fever when Sarah was only 12. She would rebuild, alone and on her own terms. Her newfound optimism dimmed slightly when she spotted Blake Quinn emerging from the bank across the street. He saw her at the same moment and raised a hand in greeting before crossing to join her. "Miss Larson," he said with a nod. "You're looking better today, Mrs. Henderson was kind enough to lend me some clothes," Sarah explained, uncomfortable with his scrutiny. "They suit you," Blake observed. "Have you had any luck finding work?" "As a matter of fact, I just secured a position at the general store," Sarah replied, unable to keep a note of pride from her voice. "Mabel's a good sort," Blake said approvingly. "She'll treat you fair." Sarah shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. "If you'll excuse me, Mr. Quinn, I should get back to the boarding house." "Actually," Blake said, "I was wondering if you might join me for lunch. The hotel serves a decent meal and I'd like to hear more about what happened at your ranch." Sarah stiffened. "Why would you care about that?" "Because James Holloway and his gang have been causing trouble all across this part of Texas," Blake explained, his expression growing serious. "And some of us are determined to put a stop to it." Sarah studied him, torn between her instinct to keep her distance and the possibility that Blake might actually help bring James to justice. "Who's us?" "A group of ranchers and townsfolk who have had enough," Blake said. "Some have lost cattle to Holloway's rustling, Others have had land stolen through forged deeds or intimidation. Your father wasn't the first to resist, but he may have paid the highest price. After a moment's consideration, Sarah nodded. I'll have lunch with you, Mr. Quinn, but only to discuss Holloway. The hotel dining room was quiet at this hour, with only a few tables occupied. Blake led Sarah to a corner table and pulled out her chair, a gesture she acknowledged with a curt nod. After they'd ordered, Blake leaned forward. Tell me everything you remember about the night of the attack. Any details might help. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, steeling herself against the painful memories. It was just after midnight. Pa and I were asleep when the dogs started barking. By the time Pa got to the door with his shotgun, the barn was already on fire. She described how James and at least 5 other men surrounded the house, calling for her father to come out and face them. How her father had told her to hide in the root cellar while he tried to reason with them. I didn't listen, Sarah continued, her voice hollow. I grabbed Pa's revolver and went to the window. I heard James say that Pa had his chance to sell and now they'd take the land anyway. Pa refused to back down, said he'd die before he'd let thieves steal what he'd built. Her hands trembled slightly as she took a sip of water. There was gunfire. I saw Pa fall. Then they started torching the house. I barely made it out through the back before the whole place went up in flames. Did you recognize any of the other men? Blake asked gently. Sarah shook her head. It was dark and they were wearing bandanas over their faces, but I'd know James's voice anywhere. Blake's jaw tightened. Holloway's gotten bold, too bold. He's never killed a respected rancher before, at least not so openly. Why does he want the land so badly? Sarah asked. There've been rumors about gold in these parts for years, Blake explained. Most sensible folks don't put much stock in them, but Holloway's convinced there's a fortune to be had. He's been buying up land or taking it wherever the rumors are strongest. There's no gold on our land, Sarah said. Pa would have found it in 30 years of working that soil. Blake shrugged. Doesn't matter if it's there or not. What matters is Holloway believes it is and he's willing to kill for it. Their food arrived, momentarily halting the conversation. As they ate, Blake shared what he knew about James Holloway, that he'd appeared in the region about 2 years ago, gradually gathering a gang of hard men around him. They started with small-scale cattle rustling, then moved on to land grabs and extortion. The law hasn't been much help, Blake said. The county sheriff is stretched thin, and Holloway's careful to spread his activities across county lines, making it harder for any one lawman to build a case against him. So you've formed your own group to stop him, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. Blake met her gaze steadily. We're not vigilantes, if that's what you're thinking. We're just folks trying to protect what's ours while gathering enough evidence to bring Holloway to justice properly. And what do you want from me? Your testimony could help, Blake said. But more than that, I want to make sure you're safe. Holloway knows you survived. He might come looking to eliminate the only witness to your father's murder. A chill ran through Sarah at his words. She hadn't considered that James might still pose a danger to her. I can take care of myself, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. I don't doubt that, Blake replied. But there's safety in numbers. Our group is meeting tonight at my ranch. I'd like you to come, share what you know. After that, you can decide if you want our help or not. Sarah hesitated, weighing her options. On one hand, the thought of accepting help from strangers, especially male strangers, went against every instinct she had after James's betrayal. On the other hand, she wasn't fool enough to think she could take on James and his gang alone. How would I get there? She asked finally. I don't have a horse. I can arrange for transportation, Blake assured her. One of our members, Martha Wilson, lives in town. She could bring you out to the ranch and back. The mention of another woman eased some of Sarah's concerns. "All right," she agreed reluctantly. "I'll come to your meeting, but I'm not making any promises beyond that." Blake's expression softened. "That's all I ask." As they finished their meal, Sarah found herself studying Blake Quinn more carefully. He was undeniably handsome, with his tall frame and those startling blue eyes, but it was more than that. There was a quiet confidence about him, a steadiness that James had lacked. Still, Sarah reminded herself, James had seemed trustworthy too right up until he'd put a bullet in her father. "Thank you for lunch, Mr. Quinn," Sarah said as they left the hotel. "Blake," he corrected with a small smile. "If we're going to be working together, we might as well use first names." "We're not working together yet," Sarah pointed out, "and I prefer to maintain proper formality." Blake shrugged good-naturedly. "As you wish, Miss Larson. Martha will call for you at the boarding house around 6 this evening." As Sarah watched him walk away, she wondered if she was making another mistake by agreeing to attend this meeting. But the alternative, doing nothing while James Holloway remained free to harm others, was unacceptable. For now, she would listen to what Blake and his group had to say. Beyond that, she would keep her own counsel and trust no one. True to Blake's word, Martha Wilson arrived at the boarding house promptly at 6 that evening. She was a sturdy woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that Sarah appreciated immediately. "You must be Sarah," Martha said, offering a firm handshake. "Blake told me what happened to your father. I'm truly sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Sarah replied, surprised by the genuine sympathy in the other woman's voice. Martha led her to a wagon parked outside. "It's about an hour's ride to the Quinn place. Plenty of time for you to ask any questions you might have before we get there." As they traveled along the dusty road leading out of Oak Ridge, Sarah did have questions, many of them. She learned that Martha owned the town's dress shop and had lost her husband to illness 3 years earlier. She joined Blake's group after James Holloway tried to force her to sell her late husband's small ranch on the outskirts of town. "Blake stepped in when Holloway's men were threatening me," Martha explained. "He didn't have to get involved, but that's the kind of man he is. Always looking out for others, even at his own expense." "How many people are in this group?" Sarah asked. "About a dozen regulars," Martha replied. "Ranchers mostly, but some townsfolk too, anyone who's had trouble with Holloway or who's worried they might be next." "And what exactly do you do?" Martha considered the question. "We share information, for one thing. Keep track of Holloway's movements, try to anticipate where he might strike next. We've organized night patrols of the ranches, making it harder for his gang to rustle cattle or intimidate folks. And we've been collecting evidence, names, dates, details of crimes, anything that might help build a case strong enough that the law can't ignore it." The explanation was reasonable, even commendable, but Sarah remained wary. "It sounds dangerous." "It can be," Martha admitted. "But doing nothing is more dangerous in the long run. Holloway won't stop until someone stops him." The rest of the journey passed with Martha pointing out landmarks and sharing bits of local history. By the time they reached the entrance to Blake's ranch, marked by a wooden arch bearing the brand of the Circle Q, the sun was beginning to set, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. Blake's ranch house was larger than Sarah had expected, a 2-story structure built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Several horses and wagons were already tied up out front, indicating that others had arrived before them. Blake himself emerged from the house as Martha brought the wagon to a stop. "Ladies," he greeted them, helping first Martha and then Sarah down from the wagon. "Glad you could make it, Miss Larson." Sarah nodded stiffly, suddenly nervous about facing a room full of strangers and reliving the worst night of her life. As if sensing her discomfort, Blake lowered his voice. "You don't have to share anything you're not comfortable with," he assured her. "Just listening is enough for tonight." The gathering inside was less formal than Sarah had anticipated. About 15 people occupied Blake's spacious main room, sitting on chairs, sofas, and even a few cushions on the floor. They ranged in age from a young man who couldn't be much older than Sarah to an elderly gentleman with a magnificent white beard. 3 women besides Martha were present, including a young Mexican woman who sat beside her husband near the fireplace. Blake introduced Sarah to the group, explaining briefly who she was and what had happened to her father. The faces that turned toward her showed genuine sympathy and, in some cases, a shared understanding of loss. "Miss Larson has agreed to tell us what she witnessed the night Thomas Larson was killed," Blake said. "But before we get to that, let's bring everyone up to speed on what we know about Holloway's recent activities." For the next half hour, various members of the group shared information: a cattle raid at the Johnson place 3 nights ago, suspicious strangers asking questions in town about which ranches might be for sale, rumors that Holloway was recruiting more men from as far away as Oklahoma Territory. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she found that the words came more easily than she'd expected. These people weren't strangers seeking gossip. They were allies who had suffered similar losses and faced similar threats. She told them everything she remembered about the night of the attack, from the first sounds of the dogs barking to her escape through the burning house. "There's one more thing," she added when she'd finished the main account. "The next morning, before I left what was left of the ranch, I overheard 2 of Holloway's men who'd come back to search the ruins. They were arguing about whether to keep looking for something. One said the map has to be here somewhere, and the other said Holloway would have their hides if they didn't find it." Blake leaned forward, his expression intent. "A map? You didn't mention this earlier." "I wasn't sure it was important," Sarah explained, "and I was still processing everything that had happened." "Did your father ever mention a map?" asked the elderly man with the white beard, whom Blake had introduced as Judge Willard, retired from the circuit court but still respected throughout the county. Sarah shook her head. "No, but Pa was private about some things. He kept important papers in a lockbox in his bedroom. The lockbox wasn't there when I checked before leaving. Holloway's men must have taken it." The revelation sparked a flurry of discussion among the group. The consensus seemed to be that whatever map Holloway was searching for, it must be connected to the rumored gold deposits. "If Holloway believes your father had a map to the gold," Blake said, "that explains why he was willing to resort to murder when your father refused to sell. It wasn't just the land he wanted, it was what he thought was on the land or information about it." "But why kill Pa if he wanted the map?" Sarah asked, the pain of her loss sharpening her voice. "Why not force him to hand it over?" "Holloway's not known for his patience or his clear thinking," Martha pointed out. "He might have planned to intimidate your father, and things got out of hand." The discussion continued, with various members suggesting strategies for gathering more information about the map and Holloway's plans. Sarah listened, impressed despite herself by the group's organization and commitment. These weren't vigilantes thirsting for blood. They were ordinary people trying to protect their community when the law had failed them. As the meeting drew to a close, Blake addressed the group once more. "In light of what we've learned tonight, I think we need to increase our patrols and our efforts to gather intelligence. Holloway's desperation for this map makes him even more dangerous." He turned to Sarah. "Miss Larson, I know you've only just arrived in Oak Ridge, but I believe you're still in danger. Holloway might think you know something about this map, or he might simply want to eliminate the only witness to your father's murder." "What are you suggesting?" Sarah asked warily. That you stay here at the ranch for a while, Blake replied. I have plenty of room, and my housekeeper, Mrs. Gunderson, would provide proper chaperonage. Before Sarah could refuse, Martha spoke up. It's a sensible suggestion, Sarah. The boarding house in town isn't secure, and you'd be safer here with Blake's ranch hands nearby. Sarah looked around the room, noting the concerned expressions on the faces of these people who, just hours ago, had been complete strangers. Their genuine worry touched something inside her, but her recently reinforced walls remained firmly in place. I appreciate the offer, she said carefully, but I've only just secured employment in town. I can't afford to lose that opportunity. What if we arrange transportation for you? Blake suggested. You could work in town during the day and return to the ranch each evening. It's not ideal, but it would be safer than staying in town alone. Sarah hesitated, torn between her fierce independence and the practical recognition of her vulnerability. I'll consider it, she finally conceded. As the meeting broke up and people began to depart, Blake approached Sarah once more. Would you like a tour of the place before Martha takes you back to town? The request seemed innocent enough, and Sarah found herself curious about the ranch Blake had built. All right, she agreed. While Martha chatted with the other departing guests, Blake showed Sarah through the spacious house. Unlike her father's modest ranch house, Blake's home boasted a large kitchen with a proper cook stove, a dining room that could seat at least a dozen, and even a small library filled with books. My mother was a school teacher, Blake explained when he caught Sarah examining the bookshelves. She believed education was the greatest gift you could give a child. After she died, I brought her books out here from back east. It's an impressive collection, Sarah said, running her fingers along the spines of leather-bound volumes. My mother loved books too. We didn't have many, but she read to me every night before she passed. How old were you? Blake asked gently. 12, Sarah replied. Fever took her. Pa and I managed on our own after that. Blake nodded in understanding. I lost my father when I was 15, riding accident. My mother and I carried on for another 5 years before her heart gave out. The shared experience of loss created a momentary connection between them, a brief lowering of Sarah's carefully constructed defenses. She quickly raised them again, reminding herself that a few shared experiences and a house full of books didn't make Blake Quinn trustworthy. They continued the tour, with Blake showing her the guest rooms upstairs, one of which would be hers if she accepted his offer of sanctuary. The room was larger than her space at the boarding house, with a comfortable-looking bed, a dresser with a mirror, and windows that overlooked the corral and the rolling grasslands beyond. What do you think? Blake asked as they returned downstairs. It's a beautiful home, Sarah acknowledged. You've built something impressive here. Thank you, Blake said. It's taken 10 years of hard work, but it's been worth it. As they stepped onto the porch, Sarah found Martha waiting for her by the wagon. Ready to head back? The older woman asked. Sarah nodded, suddenly exhausted by the emotional toll of the evening. Think about my offer, Blake said as he helped her into the wagon. You'd be safer here. I'll let you know my decision tomorrow, Sarah promised. As Martha drove them back toward town, the older woman glanced at Sarah. Blake Quinn is one of the good ones, you know, not like Holloway. I'm sure he seems that way, Sarah replied, her tone neutral. Martha sighed. I understand your caution after what you've been through, but not all men are cut from the same cloth as James Holloway. Perhaps not, Sarah conceded, but I've learned the hard way that appearances can be deceiving. Fair enough, Martha said. Just don't let one man's betrayal close your heart to everything and everyone. That's giving Holloway more power than he deserves. The words struck Sarah more deeply than she cared to admit. Was that what she was doing? Allowing James to control her future by refusing to trust again? The thought was uncomfortable, but she pushed it aside. Better to be cautious than to risk another devastating betrayal. When they reached the boarding house, Martha surprised Sarah by pulling her into a brief, motherly hug. "Whatever you decide about Blake's offer, know that you have friends here now. You don't have to face Holloway alone." Sarah managed a small smile. "Thank you, Martha, for everything." Inside her room, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her mind whirling with all she'd learned that evening. The revelation about the map added a new dimension to her father's murder, one that made her feel both more vulnerable and more determined to see James brought to justice. As for Blake's offer of protection, Sarah sighed, acknowledging to herself that it was probably the most sensible course of action. James was still out there, possibly looking for her, and the boarding house offered little security. But accepting Blake's help meant placing a degree of trust in him that Sarah wasn't sure she was capable of anymore. "I'll never trust again," she had vowed amid the ashes of her home. Could she make an exception for Blake Quinn and his band of concerned citizens? Or was she setting herself up for another heartbreak or worse? With these troubled thoughts circling in her mind, Sarah finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, her father's revolver tucked beneath her pillow. Morning brought clarity. Sarah arose with the dawn, her decision made. She would accept Blake's offer of protection not out of trust, but out of pragmatism. She would continue to work at the general store, maintaining her independence while allowing Blake and his group to help keep her safe from James Holloway. It was a compromise her practical father would have approved of. After breakfast, Sarah informed Mrs. Henderson of her plans to stay at the Circle Q ranch while continuing to work in town. "Sensible girl," the boarding house keeper said approvingly. "Blake Quinn runs a respectable establishment, and with Mrs. Gunderson there as chaperone, your reputation won't suffer. Besides, you'll be safer out there than here in town where anyone might come looking for you." "I'll keep the room for now," Sarah said, counting out coins for another week's rent, "until I'm sure this arrangement will work out." Mrs. Henderson nodded in understanding. "Your room will be here if you need it." At the general store, Mabel was equally supportive of Sarah's decision. "Blake's a good man," she said as she showed Sarah how to operate the cash register. "He helped my son when his crops failed 2 years ago. Didn't ask for anything in return, just said to pay it forward when the time came." Sarah was beginning to tire of hearing about Blake Quinn's virtues from seemingly every woman in Oak Ridge. "He seems capable," she allowed. Mabel's knowing smile suggested she saw right through Sarah's attempted indifference. "That he is. And easy on the eyes, too, if you don't mind my saying so." Sarah busied herself rearranging a display of canned goods, hoping the older woman wouldn't notice the flush that crept into her cheeks. "I hadn't noticed," she lied. The morning passed quickly as Sarah learned the rhythms of the store. Mabel was a patient teacher, and Sarah found that she enjoyed the work more than she'd expected. It was satisfying to help customers find what they needed, to organize the shelves, and to learn the business side of running the store. Shortly before noon, the bell above the door jingled and Sarah looked up to see Blake entering the store. He nodded to Mabel before approaching the counter where Sarah stood. "Miss Larson," he greeted her. "I hope you slept well after all the excitement last night." "Well enough," Sarah replied. "I've considered your offer, Mr. Quinn." "And I accept," Sarah said simply. "Though I want to be clear that this is a temporary arrangement until the situation with Holloway is resolved." Blake's expression brightened. "Of course, I'm glad you're being sensible about this." "Don't mistake practicality for trust," Sarah warned him. "I'm accepting your help because it's the logical course of action, not because I believe in your good intentions." Rather than taking offense, Blake seemed amused by her bluntness. Fair enough. I suppose I'll just have to earn your trust one day at a time. The words caught Sarah off guard. There was no mockery in his tone, only a quiet determination that made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite define. I should get back to work, she said, gesturing to the shelves she'd been restocking. Of course, Blake agreed. I'll arrange to have Martha bring you out to the ranch after you finish here. Would that suit you? Sarah nodded, already turning back to her task. That would be fine, thank you. As Blake left the store, Mabel approached Sarah with a knowing look. That man's sweet on you already, she observed. Don't be ridiculous, Sarah scoffed. He's merely being kind out of a sense of obligation. Everyone says he can't help himself when it comes to helping people in need. MMHMM, Mabel hummed skeptically. I've known Blake Quinn for 8 years, and I've never seen him look at a woman the way he looks at you. Sarah shook her head, dismissing the older woman's romantic notions. You're seeing what you want to see. Mr. Quinn and I have a practical arrangement, nothing more. But as the day wore on, Sarah found Mabel's words returning to her mind. Was it possible that Blake saw her as more than just a responsibility, a neighbor in need of protection? And if he did, how did she feel about that? The answer came swiftly and certainly. It didn't matter how Blake Quinn felt about her. Sarah had no room in her life for romantic entanglements, not now, perhaps not ever again. Her heart was locked away, the key thrown into the deepest well of distrust. If Blake harbored any hopes beyond friendship, he would be disappointed. True to his word, Blake arranged for Martha to collect Sarah after she finished her shift at the general store. This time, Martha's wagon was loaded with supplies from town flour, sugar, coffee, and other necessities. Blake asked me to pick up a few things while I was in town, Martha explained as they set off for the Circle Q. Mrs. Gunderson's been baking up a storm, getting ready for your arrival. She needn't go to any trouble on my account, Sarah said, embarrassed by the fuss. Martha chuckled. Try telling Mrs. Gunderson that. She's Norwegian, stubborn as they come, and she believes every problem can be solved with enough food. You'll be lucky if you don't gain 10 pounds in your first week. As they traveled, Martha filled Sarah in on the other residents of the Circle Q, the ranch hands, the housekeeper, and Blake's foreman, a taciturn man named Eduardo who had been with Blake since he first established the ranch. Eduardo's wife, Lucia, helps Mrs. Gunderson with the housekeeping, Martha explained. They live in a small cabin near the main house with their children, Miguel and Rosalita. Lovely family. By the time they arrived at the ranch, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in spectacular shades of pink and gold. Blake was waiting on the porch, and he came down to help with the supplies and to welcome Sarah. Mrs. Gunderson has dinner almost ready, he said as he carried Sarah's small bag of belongings. I hope you're hungry. She tends to cook enough for an army. The inside of the house was even more welcoming than Sarah remembered from the previous night. Lamps glowed warmly in every room, and delicious smells wafted from the kitchen. A fire crackled in the main room's large stone fireplace, taking the edge off the evening chill. Mrs. Gunderson turned out to be a robust woman in her 60s with rosy cheeks and a no-nonsense manner. So you're the girl who's got everyone in a tizzy, she said, looking Sarah up and down. Too thin, but we'll fix that. Dinner's in 20 minutes. Blake, show her where to wash up. Blake led Sarah upstairs to the room she'd seen the night before. Mrs. Gunderson has put fresh linens on the bed, and there's water in the pitcher for washing. The bathroom is at the end of the hall. We have indoor plumbing, one of my few luxuries. It's very comfortable, Sarah said, genuinely impressed by the thought that had gone into preparing for her arrival. I'll leave you to settle in, Blake said. Come down when you're ready for dinner." Left alone, Sarah unpacked her few belongings, placing her father's revolver in the drawer of the bedside table. She washed her face and hands in the basin, then changed into the nicer of the two dresses Mrs. Henderson had lent her. As she pinned up her hair, Sarah caught her reflection in the mirror and was startled by the woman who stared back at her. In just a few days, she had changed. There was a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a wariness that aged her beyond her 22 years. "This is who I am now," she told her reflection. "This is who I have to be." Dinner was a livelier affair than Sarah had anticipated. Martha stayed to eat, and Eduardo and Lucia joined them at the large dining table along with their children. Mrs. Gunderson served a feast of roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from Blake's garden. The conversation flowed easily around the table, with Miguel eagerly sharing stories about a new colt that had been born the day before, and Rosalita shyly showing Sarah a doll she had made from corn husks. Throughout the meal, Sarah was conscious of Blake at the head of the table, watching her interactions with a smile that seemed both pleased and relieved. After dinner, Martha bid them goodbye, promising to return in the morning to take Sarah to work. Eduardo and his family also retired to their cabin, leaving Sarah with Blake and Mrs. Gunderson. "I'll show you the rest of the ranch tomorrow if you'd like," Blake offered as they sat in the main room, coffee cups in hand. "It's too dark now to see much." "I'd like that," Sarah said, surprised to find she meant it. The evening had been pleasant, almost making her forget the circumstances that had brought her to the Circle Q. Almost, but not quite. As if reading her thoughts, Blake's expression grew serious. "I've sent word to some contacts in neighboring counties, asking if they've heard anything about Holloway's movements. Until we know more, I think it's best if you're not alone, especially in town." "I won't live in fear," Sarah said firmly. "I need to work to rebuild my life." "I understand that," Blake assured her. "I'm not suggesting you hide away, just that we take reasonable precautions. Martha or I will accompany you to and from town. Eduardo or one of the other ranch hands will keep an eye on the general store while you're working." Sarah wanted to object to being guarded like a child, but she recognized the sense in Blake's words. "All right," she agreed reluctantly. For now, Mrs. Gunderson, who had been quietly knitting in a corner, looked up with a snort. "You two are peas in a pod, both stubborn as mules," Blake chuckled. "Mrs. Gunderson has been trying to manage me for years. She's given up hope that I'll ever become sensible." "Not given up," the older woman corrected. "Just taking a rest before the next battle." Their easy banter made Sarah feel both welcome and slightly envious. This was what a home should feel like: warm, comfortable, filled with people who genuinely cared for each other. It was what her home with her father had been before James Holloway destroyed it all. The familiar ache of loss tightened Sarah's chest, and she set down her coffee cup. "If you'll excuse me, I think I'll retire for the night. It's been a long day." Blake rose politely. "Of course. Sleep well, Miss Larson. If you need anything, Mrs. Gunderson's room is across the hall from yours and mine is at the end of the corridor." Sarah nodded her thanks and made her way upstairs, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. The kindness of these people touched her deeply, yet she remained determined to keep her emotional distance. She could accept their help without opening her heart to them, without risking the pain of betrayal again. As she prepared for bed, Sarah found herself standing at the window, gazing out at the starlit expanse of the Circle Q. In the distance, a coyote howled, the sound lonely and haunting. Sarah pressed her hand against the cool glass, feeling just as isolated despite being surrounded by people. "I'll be strong," she whispered to the night. "I'll survive this, but I'll never trust again." The next few days established a routine. Each morning, Martha or occasionally Blake would drive Sarah into town, where she would work at the general store under Mabel's guidance. She quickly proved herself capable and efficient, winning the approval of both Mabel and the store's regular customers. In the evenings, she would return to the Circle Q for dinner and quiet evenings spent in the main room, where Blake often read aloud from one of his books, while Mrs. Gunderson knitted and Sarah mended clothing or helped with household accounts. Despite her determination to maintain emotional distance, Sarah found herself gradually relaxing in the peaceful atmosphere of the ranch. The nightmares that had plagued her since her father's death became less frequent, and she began to sleep through the night without waking in terror. On the fourth day of this new arrangement, Mabel left Sarah alone in the store while she attended a church committee meeting. The morning passed uneventfully, with a steady stream of customers keeping Sarah busy. Shortly before noon, the bell above the door jingled, and Sarah looked up with a smile that froze on her face. James Holloway stood in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the light from outside. He was just as handsome as Sarah remembered: dark hair, green eyes, a charming smile that now turned her stomach. He was dressed like a respectable businessman in a well-cut suit, nothing about his appearance suggesting the murderer he truly was. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying the same warm tones that had once made her heart race. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward the pocket of her apron, where she'd taken to carrying her father's revolver. "Get out," she said, her voice low and steady despite the fear coursing through her. James stepped further into the store, glancing around as if to ensure they were alone. "Now, is that any way to greet an old friend? Especially when I've come all this way to make sure you're all right." "You killed my father," Sarah said, her fingers closing around the revolver in her pocket. "You burned our home to the ground. We are not friends." James had the audacity to look hurt. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding, Sarah. I wasn't even there that night. Some of my associates took matters into their own hands against my explicit instructions. I've been sick about it ever since." "Liar," Sarah hissed. She drew the revolver and pointed it at him, her hand surprisingly steady. "I heard your voice. I saw you." James raised his hand slowly, his expression turning serious. "Put that away before someone gets hurt, Sarah. I just want to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," Sarah said. "Leave now, or I swear I'll shoot." The bell above the door jingled again, and Eduardo stepped into the store, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. His dark eyes took in the scene in an instant, and he moved to stand beside Sarah. "Is there a problem, Miss Larson?" he asked, his gaze never leaving James. "This man was just leaving," Sarah said firmly. James's charming smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Another time then, Sarah. We have unfinished business, you and I." He tipped his hat and backed toward the door. "Give my regards to Quinn." After James had gone, Sarah's knees finally gave way and she sank onto a nearby stool, the revolver still clutched in her trembling hand. "Are you hurt?" Eduardo asked, concern evident in his usually stoic face. Sarah shook her head. "No, but that was James Holloway." Eduardo's expression darkened. "Blake will want to know about this. He sent me to check on you while he meets with the sheriff. It seems Holloway has been asking questions about you all over town." "He said we have unfinished business," Sarah said, her voice steadier now that the initial shock was wearing off. "I think he's still looking for whatever map he believes my father had." "We should return to the ranch," Eduardo suggested. "It's not safe for you here alone." Sarah was about to agree when Mabel returned, her cheerful greeting dying on her lips as she took in Sarah's pale face and the revolver in her hand. "What in heaven's name happened?" After Eduardo explained the situation, Mabel insisted that Sarah return to the Circle Q immediately. "I can manage the store for the rest of the day. Your safety is more important." This time, Sarah didn't argue. The encounter with James had shaken her more than she cared to admit, bringing back the terror of the night her father died in vivid detail. Eduardo drove her back to the ranch in silence, his keen eyes constantly scanning the road and surrounding countryside for any sign of pursuit. When they arrived, Blake was waiting on the porch, his expression grim. "Eduardo sent word ahead," he explained as he helped Sarah down from the wagon. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Sarah said automatically, though the persistent trembling in her hands belied her words. Blake led her inside, where Mrs. Gunderson immediately pressed a cup of strong, sweet tea into her hands. "Drink," the housekeeper ordered. "Good for shock." As Sarah sipped the tea, Blake sat across from her, his blue eyes filled with concern and barely suppressed anger. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. Sarah recounted her encounter with James, including his claim that he hadn't been present the night of the attack and his ominous parting words. "He's lying about not being there," Blake said when she finished, "and he's dangerous. The sheriff told me Holloway's been asking about you all over the county, offering rewards for information on your whereabouts. He wants the map," Sarah said with certainty. "Whatever it is, he thinks I have it or know where it is." Blake nodded thoughtfully. "Your father never mentioned anything about a map to you, nothing about gold or mineral rights." Sarah shook her head. "Nothing specific, but—" She hesitated, a memory surfacing. "A few weeks before he died, Pa did say something strange. We were discussing the future of the ranch, and he said, 'There's more value in this land than meets the eye, Sarah. Someday you'll understand.' I thought he was just being philosophical." Blake leaned forward, his expression intent. "Could he have hidden something on the property? Something Holloway's men might have missed in their search?" Sarah considered the question. "Maybe. Pa had all sorts of hiding places around the ranch. He was cautious by nature, especially after my mother died. We need to search what's left of your ranch," Blake decided. "If there is a map, and if Holloway hasn't found it yet, it could be the key to understanding what he's after and possibly to bringing him to justice." The thought of returning to the charred ruins of her home made Sarah's chest tighten with dread. "I don't know if I can go back there," she admitted, hating the weakness in her voice. Blake's expression softened. "You don't have to go, Sarah. I can take Eduardo and a couple of the other hands. You can tell us where to look." But even as he made the offer, Sarah knew she had to return. If there was something hidden there, something that might help bring her father's killer to justice, she needed to find it herself. It was what her father would have expected of her. "No," she said firmly. "I'll go, tomorrow at first light." Blake studied her face, then nodded. "All right. But we'll go prepared for trouble. If Holloway's looking for something on your property, he might have men watching it." That night, Sarah slept fitfully, her dreams filled with flames and her father's voice calling to her from behind a wall of fire. She awoke before dawn, exhausted but determined. Blake was already in the kitchen when she came downstairs, speaking quietly with Eduardo while Mrs. Gunderson prepared a hearty breakfast. The atmosphere was tense, purposeful, like soldiers preparing for battle. "I've sent 2 men ahead to scout the area," Blake informed Sarah as she joined them at the table. "If Holloway has people watching your property, we'll know before we arrive." After breakfast, they set out Blake, Sarah, Eduardo, and 2 trusted ranch hands. Each was armed, and Blake insisted that Sarah wear a man's duster over her dress to help conceal her identity from a distance. The journey to the Larson ranch took just over an hour, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the landscape. As they approached the burned-out shell of the main house, Sarah fought back a wave of grief and nausea. The charred timbers stood stark against the blue sky, a grim monument to all she had lost. Blake's scouts reported no sign of Holloway or his men, but Blake remained cautious, posting one man as a lookout while the rest began their search. Sarah led them through the ruins, pointing out places her father might have hidden something important beneath floorboards in his bedroom, behind a loose stone in the fireplace, in the old well near the barn. Hour after hour, they searched, finding nothing but ash and broken dreams. By midday, Sarah was filthy and disheartened, ready to concede that if there had been a map, it had either burned in the fire or been taken by Holloway's men. "Let's take a break," Blake suggested, seeing her flagging energy. "Have some water, rest a bit." They retreated to the shade of a lone oak tree that had survived the fire, passing around a canteen of water. Sarah leaned against the tree trunk, closing her eyes for a moment as memories washed over her, helping her father plant this very tree when she was just a child, climbing its branches as a girl, sitting beneath it with her mother on warm summer evenings. Her eyes snapped open. "The tree," she said suddenly. Blake looked at her questioningly. "What about it? Pa and I planted this tree the year after Ma died," Sarah explained, excitement building in her voice. "He said it would be our special place to remember her. He used to leave little gifts for me hidden in the trunk, a ribbon, a piece of candy, a new pencil." She moved to the base of the tree, running her hands over the bark until she found what she was looking for, a small, almost invisible seam where the trunk had been hollowed out and a piece carefully fitted back into place. It had been years since her father had left her gifts there, but the hiding place remained. With Blake's help, Sarah pried open the section of bark, revealing a small cavity within the trunk. Inside was an oilskin packet, carefully wrapped and sealed against the elements. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it, revealing several folded documents. The first was a deed to the Larson property, listing both Thomas and Sarah Larson as owners. The second was a letter addressed to Sarah in her father's handwriting, dated just a month before his death. And the third was what they had been searching for, a carefully drawn map of the region, with the Larson ranch clearly marked, along with several other properties in the area. But it wasn't gold that the map depicted. It was water. "Underground springs," Blake breathed, studying the map over Sarah's shoulder. "Your father mapped the underground water sources across 3 counties. Sarah read her father's letter, tears welling in her eyes as his voice seemed to speak to her from beyond the grave. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, something has happened to me, and for that, I am truly sorry. I've tried to protect you from the dangers of this world, perhaps too much." The map enclosed with this letter represents years of careful observation and study. The land in these parts is harsh, but beneath it runs the lifeblood of Texas water, pure and plentiful, in underground rivers and springs that few know exist. I've kept this knowledge secret because men like James Holloway would stop at nothing to control these water sources. In the years to come, water will be more valuable than gold in this part of Texas. Whoever controls the water will control the future. I've entrusted copies of this map to Judge Willard and to Reverend Thomas in Oak Ridge. If anything happens to me, take this information to them. They will know what to do. Remember that I love you, my brave girl, and that I trust you to do what's right with this knowledge. Your loving father, Thomas Larson." Sarah folded the letter carefully, her mind racing. "It wasn't gold he was after," she said, looking up at Blake. "It was water. Pa found underground springs on our land, on all this land, and Holloway wants to control them." Blake nodded grimly. "Water rights are already causing disputes all across Texas. A man who controlled the underground water sources in 3 counties would have power over every rancher and farmer in the region. They'd have to pay whatever he asked, or watch their cattle die and their crops wither. "We need to get this to Judge Willard," Sarah said, remembering her father's instructions. Blake agreed, helping her secure the precious documents inside her coat. They wasted no time in leaving the ruins of the Larson ranch, aware that their discovery could put them in even greater danger if Holloway learned of it. The journey back to the Circle Q was tense, everyone alert for signs of pursuit or ambush. But they reached the ranch without incident, and Blake immediately sent a rider to bring Judge Willard to them. While they waited, Sarah reread her father's letter, finding comfort in his words even as she mourned his loss anew. He had been protecting not just his own land but the future of the entire region. His death had been even more senseless and tragic than she had realized. Judge Willard arrived just before sundown, his weathered face grave as he examined the map and read Thomas Larson's letter. "I have my copy of the map locked in my safe," he confirmed. "Thomas gave it to me for safekeeping about 6 months ago, but I didn't know the full significance of it until now." "What do we do?" Sarah asked. "How do we stop Holloway?" The judge considered the question carefully. "This evidence, combined with your eyewitness testimony about your father's murder, should be enough to convince the territorial governor to send federal marshals. Holloway has friends among the local law, but the federal authorities won't be so easily swayed." "How long will that take?" Blake asked. "A week, perhaps 2, the judge replied. "I'll write to the governor tonight and send the letter by express rider in the morning." "And in the meantime," Sarah pressed. Judge Willard's expression was solemn. "In the meantime, you must be extremely careful. Holloway knows you survived the attack, and he knows you're connected to Blake now. Both of you are in danger until Holloway is behind bars." After the judge departed, Blake found Sarah on the porch staring out at the darkening landscape. "Are you all right?" he asked, joining her at the railing. Sarah managed a small, sad smile. "I'm glad to finally understand why Pa died. It wasn't just senseless violence, he was trying to protect something important." "He was a good man," Blake said quietly, "from everything I've heard about him." "The best," Sarah agreed, tears pricking at her eyes. "He taught me everything: how to ride, how to shoot, how to stand up for what's right. But he also taught me to believe in people, to trust." Her voice hardened. "That's the part I can't follow anymore." Blake was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Trust isn't something that comes easily, especially after betrayal," he finally said. "It has to be earned." "I'll never trust again," Sarah vowed, the words emerging as a whisper. "Not with my heart, not with my future. The risk is too great." Blake turned to look at her, his blue eyes reflecting the last golden light of day. "Then I'll earn it," he said simply. "One day at a time." The quiet conviction in his voice made Sarah's breath catch. She studied his face, the strong line of his jaw, the tiny scar above his right eyebrow, the kindness in his eyes that she'd come to recognize over the past days. For a brief, unsettling moment, she allowed herself to imagine trusting him, opening her heart to the possibility that not all men were like James Holloway. The moment passed, and Sarah looked away, her walls firmly back in place. "We should go inside," she said. "Mrs. Gunderson will have dinner ready soon." But as they turned toward the house, Sarah was uncomfortably aware that something had shifted between them. Blake Quinn had declared his intentions, not with flowery words or grand gestures, but with a simple promise that resonated with her more deeply than she cared to admit. The next 2 weeks passed in a state of tense vigilance. Sarah continued to work at the general store, now accompanied at all times by either Blake or one of his trusted hands. There was no further sign of James Holloway in town, but rumors reached them that he was gathering his men at his ranch on the far side of the county. Judge Willard received word that the governor had dispatched federal marshals, who were expected to arrive within days. The end seemed in sight, but Blake insisted on maintaining their precautions, convinced that Holloway would make one more attempt to find the map before the law closed in on him. Throughout this period of waiting, Sarah found herself watching Blake when he thought she wasn't looking, noting the care he took to ensure her safety while respecting her independence, the genuine kindness he showed to everyone from Mrs. Gunderson to the youngest stable boy, the quiet competence with which he ran his ranch. Each day, in small ways, he worked to earn her trust, not demanding it, not expecting it, simply demonstrating through his actions that he was worthy of it. And despite her determination to keep her heart locked away, Sarah felt her defenses beginning to weaken. One evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky in spectacular shades of orange and pink, Sarah found herself telling Blake about her childhood on the ranch, about her mother's gentle wisdom and her father's steadfast love. "They had such a beautiful marriage," she said wistfully. "They disagreed sometimes, of course, but there was always respect, always love. I used to think I'd have that someday." "You still could," Blake said quietly. Sarah shook her head. "Some things, once broken, can't be fixed. My ability to trust is one of them." "I don't believe that," Blake replied. "Trust can be rebuilt just like a house after a fire. It takes time and patience, but it's possible." "Is that what you're trying to do, rebuild my trust?" Blake smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Among other things." Before Sarah could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of a rider, his horse lathered from hard riding. It was one of Blake's hands who had been in town gathering supplies. "Holloway's men are in town," the rider reported breathlessly. "At least a dozen of them, all armed. They're asking about you, Blake, and about Miss Larson. It looks like they're planning something." Blake's expression turned grim. "Get Eduardo and the others. Tell them to prepare for trouble." He turned to Sarah. "You should stay inside, away from the windows." Sarah straightened her spine. "This is my fight too, Blake. Holloway killed my father. If he's coming for us, I intend to be ready." After a moment's hesitation, Blake nodded. "All right, but stay close to me." The night that followed was one of the longest of Sarah's life. Blake's men took up positions around the ranch house, watching the roads and the surrounding countryside. Mrs. Gunderson prepared food for everyone, her usual complaints absent in the face of the serious threat. Shortly after midnight, a sentry reported movement along the creek that bordered the western edge of the ranch. Minutes later, another spotted riders approaching from the north. "They're trying to surround us," Blake said, checking his rifle, "but they don't know the land like we do." Sarah stood beside him, her father's revolver in her hand, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. This was the moment she had been preparing for since the night her father died, the chance to face James Holloway and see justice done. The first shots came just before dawn, the crack of rifles shattering the pre-morning stillness. Blake's men returned fire, their positions carefully chosen to provide maximum coverage of the approaches to the house. "They're testing our defenses," Blake explained as he and Sarah crouched near a window, "trying to draw our fire to see where we're positioned." For what seemed like hours, the exchange of gunfire continued sporadically. Then, as the first light of dawn broke over the eastern horizon, a voice called out from beyond the corral. "Quinn, I know you're in there. Send out the Larson girl with the map and the rest of you can walk away from this." James Holloway's voice carried clearly in the morning air, sending a chill down Sarah's spine. "That's not going to happen, Holloway," Blake called back. "The federal marshals are on their way. Your only chance is to ride out now before they arrive." Laughter greeted this announcement. "The marshals are at least a day's ride from here, Quinn. By then, you'll all be dead and I'll have what I came for." Sarah moved to Blake's side. "Let me talk to him," she whispered. "I might be able to distract him, give your men a chance to get into better positions." Blake looked at her sharply. "It's too dangerous. He could shoot you the moment you show yourself." "He won't," Sarah said with certainty. "He needs me to find the map. He doesn't know we've already recovered it." After a moment's consideration, Blake nodded reluctantly. "All right. But stay in the doorway where you have cover, and at the first sign of trouble, get back inside." Sarah moved to the front door, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. Then she called out, "James, it's Sarah. I want to talk." There was a pause, then James's voice again. "Come out where I can see you, Sarah. Let's talk face to face." "So you can shoot me." "No thank you," Sarah replied. "You killed my father, James. You burned our home. Why would I trust you now? Your father's death was a mistake," James called back. "I never meant for that to happen. All I want is the map he made. Give it to me and this ends now." "What map?" Sarah asked, feigning ignorance. "I don't know what you're talking about." From her position in the doorway, Sarah could see movement as James and several of his men moved closer, using a small rise for cover. "Don't play innocent, Sarah," James said, his voice hardening. "Your father mapped the underground water sources across 3 counties. That map is worth a fortune to the right people." "And you plan to be one of those people," Sarah said bitterly. "Controlling the water, forcing honest ranchers and farmers to pay for what should be free." "It's just business," James replied. "Nothing personal." "It was personal to my father," Sarah shot back, "and it's personal to me." While Sarah kept James talking, Blake had been signaling to his men, positioning them for what was coming. Now he whispered to Sarah, "Keep him distracted for just a few more minutes." Sarah nodded slightly, then raised her voice again. "If I did have this map, James, what would stop you from killing me once you had it? Your word," she laughed bitterly. "That's worth less than nothing to me now." "I never wanted to hurt you, Sarah," James said, his tone becoming cajoling. "I cared for you, I still do. We could work together on this. The water rights would make us both rich." The words might once have made Sarah's heart flutter, but now they only strengthened her resolve. "You're a liar and a murderer, James Holloway. The only place you're going is a prison cell or a grave." James's response was cut short by a sudden commotion from the north. The thunder of hooves and shouts of men broke the morning stillness as a dozen riders appeared, wearing the badges of U.S. Marshals. "Federal Marshals," a voice bellowed. "Drop your weapons." For a moment, chaos reigned. Some of Holloway's men threw down their guns immediately, while others opened fire on the newcomers. James himself made a desperate break for his horse, clearly intending to flee. Without thinking, Sarah darted from the doorway, raising her father's revolver. "James Holloway!" she shouted. He turned, his face a mask of rage and desperation, his hand moving to his gun. Sarah fired first, the bullet striking him in the shoulder and spinning him to the ground. Blake was at her side in an instant, his rifle trained on James as the marshals closed in around them. "It's over," Blake said, his voice steady. "Holloway's finished." In the aftermath, everything seemed to happen in a blur. The marshals took James and his men into custody. Judge Willard arrived to provide official statements about Thomas Larson's map and the water rights it documented. And the truth about James Holloway's criminal enterprise was finally exposed. Sarah watched as James was led away in handcuffs, his wounded shoulder bandaged, his face pale with pain and defeat. He looked smaller somehow, less threatening, just a greedy man whose schemes had finally caught up with him. "He'll hang for your father's murder," Judge Willard told Sarah quietly. And the governor has promised to establish legal protections for the water sources your father mapped. His legacy will be the protection of those resources for generations to come. It was nearly sunset by the time the marshals departed with their prisoners, leaving the Circle Q to recover from the day's events. The ranch hands celebrated their victory with whiskey and tall tales, while Mrs. Gunderson prepared a special dinner to mark the occasion. Sarah found herself on the porch once more, watching the sunset and trying to process everything that had happened. A chapter of her life had closed today, the chapter of fear, of pursuit, of seeking justice for her father. Now she faced a future she hadn't allowed herself to imagine before, a future where James Holloway could no longer harm her. "May I join you?" Blake's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, a bottle of wine and 2 glasses in his hands. "Of course," Sarah said, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. Blake poured the wine and handed her a glass. "To your father," he said, raising his glass in a toast, "a brave man who tried to do right by his neighbors." "To Pa," Sarah echoed, her throat tight with emotion. They sipped their wine in comfortable silence as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, leaving a canvas of stars in their wake. "What will you do now?" Blake asked eventually. "Will you rebuild your father's ranch?" Sarah had been pondering that question herself. "I don't think so," she said slowly. "Too many painful memories there. I might sell the land to someone who will respect my father's wishes about the water rights, of course. And then—" Sarah looked out at the darkening landscape, at the silhouette of the Circle Q ranch house and barns against the night sky. In the weeks she had spent here, it had begun to feel like home in a way she hadn't expected. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've been so focused on survival, on bringing James to justice, that I haven't thought much beyond that." Blake set his glass down and turned to face her. "You could stay," he said simply, "here at the Circle Q." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "As what, your housekeeper?" A smile tugged at the corner of Blake's mouth. "That wasn't exactly what I had in mind." "Blake," Sarah began, uncertainty in her voice. "I'm not sure I'm ready for—" "I'm not asking for promises," Blake interrupted gently. "I'm not even asking for trust, not yet. I'm just asking for a chance to earn that trust, one day at a time." Sarah studied his face in the soft light spilling from the windows of the house. In the weeks since they'd met, Blake Quinn had proven himself to be everything James Holloway was not: honest, kind, reliable, a man of his word. He had protected her without stifling her independence, respected her wishes even when he disagreed with them, and stood beside her in the face of danger. "I'm afraid," Sarah admitted in a whisper. "Afraid of being wrong about someone again. Afraid of being hurt." Blake reached across the space between them and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "Being afraid doesn't make you weak, Sarah. It makes you human. And healing from betrayal takes time." Sarah looked down at their joined hands, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer night. "How much time are you willing to give me?" "As much as you need," Blake replied without hesitation. "I'm not going anywhere." For the first time since her father's death, Sarah felt a flicker of hope for her future, not just for survival or justice, but for happiness. The walls around her heart hadn't come down, not yet, but perhaps they could be scaled, one careful stone at a time. "One day at a time," she said softly, echoing his earlier promise. Blake's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "One day at a time," he agreed. In the years that followed, Sarah would often look back on that moment as the true beginning of her healing. The path wasn't always easy. There were days when fear and doubt threatened to overwhelm her, when trusting Blake felt like leaping from a cliff without knowing what waited below. But true to his word, Blake never rushed her, never demanded more than she was ready to give. He courted her properly, with flowers and picnics and long rides across the Texas countryside. He introduced her to his family back east through letters and photographs, and he listened patiently as she shared more stories of her childhood and her parents. 6 months after James Holloway was hanged for the murder of Thomas Larson, Blake proposed to Sarah on the porch of the Circle Q, beneath the same stars that had witnessed their first tentative steps toward each other. "I know you said you'd never trust again," he reminded her, holding her hands in his. "And I promised to earn that trust one day at a time. I don't know if I've succeeded yet, but I'm asking you to take a leap of faith with me." Sarah looked into the eyes of the man who had become not just her protector but her partner, her confidant, her friend. The walls around her heart hadn't disappeared entirely, perhaps they never would, but they had doors now, doors that she had learned to open for the right person. "Yes," she said simply, her voice steady and sure. "Yes, I'll marry you." Their wedding was held the following spring, with Judge Willard officiating and the entire town of Oak Ridge in attendance. Sarah wore a gown of ivory silk that Martha had helped her make, and Blake looked more handsome than ever in a new black suit. As they spoke their vows beneath an arch of wildflowers on the Circle Q, Sarah felt her father's presence, his approval warming her like sunshine. She had found not just safety but love, not just justice but peace. That night, as they stood on the porch of what was now their home, Blake wrapped his arms around Sarah and pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. "Happy?" he asked. Sarah leaned back against his solid strength, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Texas sky. "Yes," she said, and meant it with her whole heart. "I'm happy." The trust she had sworn never to give again had been earned, not demanded. The love she had believed impossible had grown, one day at a time, nurtured by patience and honesty and shared purpose. And in the years that followed through the birth of their children, through droughts and storms, through all the joys and challenges that life in the West entailed, that trust never wavered. For Sarah had learned that, while trust given blindly could lead to devastation, trust earned through actions and proven over time could build something stronger than she had ever imagined possible. She had vowed never to trust again, but Blake Quinn had shown her, one day at a time, that some vows were meant to be broken so that better ones could be made in their place.